The door closed inside Buckingham Palace. No cameras, no secretaries. Not a single official line of minutes was recorded. Only a cold room, pale yellow light, and a silence so heavy that even the sound of breathing became unmistakably clear. Inside that room, Princess Anne stood facing Camilla. No polite smiles, no royal courtesy, only the direct gaze of someone who had witnessed too much to remain silent any longer. This was not an ordinary meeting, and it was certainly not a family argument. According to information leaked from internal sources, this was one of the rare moments when a senior member of the British royal family broke an unwritten rule. The rule that all conflicts must be buried behind palace doors. This time, Princess Anne did not follow it. Camilla was placed at the center of suspicion, not because of what she had done in the past, but because of what she was doing in the present. Alleged efforts to manipulate memory, to rewrite the story of Diana, and to gradually erode the last remaining trust within the House of Windsor itself. There was no shouting, no threats, only short sentences, cold, and powerful enough to freeze the entire room. And in that very moment, a question began to spread beyond the palace walls. Do you stand with Princess Anne? Or do you believe Camilla had reasons to act this way? Leave comment number 1 or number 2. Because to understand why a closed-door meeting could shake the entire monarchy, we must look at the collapsing power structure quietly unfolding behind it. By the end of 2025 and into early 2026, the British royal family entered a period of fragility unseen since the death of Princess Diana. On the surface, everything remained within traditional order. Press statements continued. Audiences were still held, but inside Buckingham Palace, no one could deny a truth that was becoming increasingly clear. The central authority of King Charles was weakening. The king's health became the greatest concern and also the most tightly controlled subject. Overseas visits were significantly reduced. Events once personally led by the monarch were quietly reassigned under the explanation of scheduling adjustments. Charles' work calendar was no longer released in detail as before. Many meetings were canceled at the last minute without clear explanation. According to data compiled by royal observers, King Charles's public appearances during this period dropped by more than 40% compared to the same period 2 years earlier. This was not a routine adjustment. It was a sign of a retreating center of power. When the figure at the top no longer appears consistently, the monarchy cannot pause. It shifts into a different mode of operation, no longer relying on public commands, no longer on clearly announced decisions. Instead, it turns to implicit agreements, behind-the-scenes exchanges, and decisions made in silence. It was precisely in this context that Prince William began to emerge as a de facto center of power. He did not need declarations. He did not need ceremony. Yet every eye within the royal family turned toward him. Senior advisors began consulting William more frequently. Long-term plans were increasingly built around his future rather than around Charles' present. William does not hold official power, but he represents the stability the system desperately needs. In the eyes of the public, he stands as the opposite of past controversies. Within the institution, he is seen as the only successor who could inherit without triggering a crisis of trust. And that reality has placed Camilla in a dangerous position. For many years, Camilla's influence existed alongside and was tightly bound to Charles. When Charles was strong, Camilla was protected. When Charles appeared regularly in public, Camilla had room to consolidate her position. But as the king's health weakened, the foundation of Camilla's power began to tremble. There are no signs that Camilla is accepted by William as an indispensable part of the monarchy's future. On the contrary, the distance between them has grown increasingly clear. No open confrontation, no public criticism, but also no warmth, no reassurance strong enough to guarantee her long-term standing. For Camilla, this is the most dangerous moment. She is not only facing public indifference, she is also confronting the risk of being pushed to the margins when the Charles era comes to an end. And within the royal family, being sidelined means losing control over the narrative of one's own legacy. Camilla understands this better than anyone. She knows that history is not written solely by victors. It is written by those who control memory. And Diana remains the largest shadow hanging over every debate about Camilla's legitimacy. When Charles is no longer strong enough to shield her, when William is not ready to protect her, Camilla is forced to find her own way to secure her position, Not through ceremony, not through declarations, but through quiet moves made within the expanding vacuum of power. And it is within that vacuum that Camilla began taking steps that alarmed many inside the family. For years, the story of Princess Diana has been the deepest fracture in Camilla's public image, not because of what has already been revealed, but because of the memories that were never fully spoken. The truths that exist only in the accounts of those who stood closest to Diana while she was alive. That is why, as Charles's authority weakened and the monarchy's future began to be viewed through William's lens, Camilla was said to have taken a highly risky step. She reached out to Diana's former advisors, not the figures who appeared before cameras, but those who worked quietly behind the scenes, those who knew where Diana cried, how deeply she despaired, and how isolated she became during her final years within the palace. These were not ceremonial meetings. There were no press releases, no public schedules. According to internal sources, many of these encounters took place in absolute privacy. No notes, no minutes, no presence of independent third parties. Some discussions were even held outside palace grounds to avoid unwanted attention. Camilla is said not to have referred to Diana directly in an overt way. Instead, she asked questions. She prompted memories. She guided conversations toward perspectives that softened her own image. This was not reconciliation with the past. It was an attempt to redefine it. Those familiar with the matter say the unspoken message in these meetings was unmistakable. The monarchy needed a new story, a different way of telling it, less painful, less confrontational, and above all, less damaging to Camilla as a transfer of power approached. The problem is that those advisors were not outsiders. They did not learn about Diana through newspapers. They lived through the years of her isolation. They witnessed her emotional breakdowns, her desperate attempts to seek protection that went unanswered. For them, memory was not something open to negotiation. Some of Diana's former advisors later admitted they felt deeply conflicted. No one threatened them. No one forced them. But the psychological pressure was real. The pressure of facing a reigning queen. The pressure of knowing that their words could be used in ways beyond their control. Some said they left those meetings feeling exploited, not because of what Camilla said, but because of what she did not say. The calculated silence, the carefully framed questions, the pauses long enough to make the other person doubt their own memories. For the public, these details almost do not exist. But within the royal family, they spread rapidly, not as baseless rumors, but as whispered warnings. That Camilla was attempting to control not only the present, but also the way history would come to view Diana. And this is precisely the line that made many feel uneasy, because Diana is no longer alive to defend herself. What remains are the memories of others. And if those memories are reshaped, they can fundamentally alter how future generations understand the greatest royal tragedy of the century. In the eyes of those loyal to Diana's legacy, this cannot be seen as reconciliation. It is viewed as an effort to erase responsibility, to blur the line between right and wrong, and more importantly, to strip away the final voice of a woman who endured immense suffering while she was alive. These concerns did not stop with former advisors. They spread to senior members of the family. Those who understand all too well that once memory is manipulated, no one can be certain that history will stand on their side. And when this information reached Princess Anne, her reaction was unlike anyone else's in the family. Within the British royal family, Princess Anne has never been someone who sought attention. She carries no media glamour. She does not build a public image through emotion. But precisely because of that, Anne's voice carries a different kind of weight. The weight of someone who has been there long enough to understand how the system truly operates, and more importantly, to understand which boundaries must never be crossed. Under Queen Elizabeth II, Anne was among the most consistently active yet least mentioned figures. She appeared regularly in state duties. Few mistakes, few statements. But when Anne spoke internally, it was usually because an issue had crossed a critical threshold. For Queen Elizabeth, Anne was not the favored figure in terms of image, but she was the one trusted on principle. Anne understood that the monarchy does not survive on personal affection. It survives on moral standards that each generation is obligated to respect. When those standards are broken, the consequences do not arrive immediately. They smolder. And when they erupt, they become uncontrollable. That is why the relationship between Anne and Diana carried a particular nuance. They were not close in the conventional sense. They did not share private images. They did not appear together to cultivate public goodwill. But Anne saw in Diana what many within the royal family chose to overlook: a woman pushed into a cold system, isolated, and gradually worn down psychologically. Anne witnessed Diana in moments that never reached the cameras, times of exhaustion, moments of confusion, and desperate attempts to be heard. To Anne, Diana was not a media symbol. Diana was a human being, and that human being had been deeply damaged by the very mechanisms the monarchy allowed to exist. Therefore, when reports of Camilla approaching Diana's former advisors reached Anne, her reaction was instinctive rather than strategic. Anne did not view this as a simple political maneuver. She saw it as direct interference in the moral legacy Diana left behind. In Anne's eyes, Diana's memory was not a tool for personal image rehabilitation. It was not material to reshape history to suit anyone's future. Diana was no longer alive to challenge the narrative, unable to speak. And for that very reason, any attempt to redefine her story carried an inherently coercive nature. Anne did not oppose Camilla because of the past. She opposed Camilla because of the present, because of crossing an ethical boundary the monarchy had long implicitly acknowledged. The boundary that Diana's suffering must be respected, not exploited, not softened, and certainly not rewritten to benefit those who had played a role in creating that tragedy. Anne's anger did not erupt immediately. It accumulated, settled, and remained controlled for a long time. But each new fragment of information, each whisper from within, each sign that Camilla was pushing further into sensitive territory of memory, all of it drove Anne toward a point of no return. For Anne, silence in this case would mean complicity, and that was something she could not accept, not because of personal emotion, but because of responsibility to the institution she had served her entire life. That simmering outrage ultimately led to a confrontation never recorded in any official document. The meeting room deep inside Buckingham Palace that day was not large. There was no long table for delegations, no national flags or ceremonial symbols. Only a space sealed tightly enough to ensure that what was spoken would not pass beyond the thick stone walls of the palace. Those present were few, but each was a figure whose words could shift the axis of an entire power structure. No one entered the room in a normal state of mind. The tension was already present before the door closed. Eyes avoided one another. There were no customary courtesies. No one smiled. No one began with lengthy formal remarks. Everyone understood that this meeting had not been called to discuss schedules or protocol. Princess Anne spoke first. She did not lean back in her chair. Her back was straight, her gaze fixed. She needed no papers, no notes. What Anne brought into the room was not documentation. It was the accumulation of months of silence and observation. Camilla sat opposite her face composed, no clear expression. She did not avoid Anne's gaze, but she did not seek confrontation either. It was the familiar calm of someone who had learned to exist under public pressure for decades. Anne did not circle the issue. She did not begin with background. She went straight to the point. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm enough that no one in the room could pretend not to hear. Anne referred to the private meetings. Diana's former advisors, questions that lacked transparency, memories pulled from the past without moral consent. No one interrupted her, not because they agreed, but because they understood that Anne had waited too long for this moment. Every sentence carried tightly controlled anger. Not emotional, not explosive, but decisive. When Anne spoke Diana's name, the atmosphere in the room visibly shifted. Diana's name always carried a particular weight. No one could hear it without feeling pressure. Anne did not describe Diana through idealized images. She spoke of a human being, a woman who had been wounded, and a memory the royal family had never truly confronted with honesty. Camilla remained silent. She did not argue. She did not explain. She did not deny. That silence was not weakness. It was strategic. Within the monarchy, silence is sometimes the only way to avoid self-accusation. But that very silence caused the tension to rise further. Anne paused for a few seconds, not to breathe, but to ensure that every eye in the room was fixed on her. And then the sentence believed to have frozen the air completely was spoken. "You have betrayed this entire family." There was no noise after those words, no immediate reaction, not because of shock, but because everyone understood the gravity of the accusation. Within the monarchy, betrayal is not an emotional charge. It is a moral verdict. Camilla looked directly at Anne. She did not show anger. She did not appear wounded. She simply remained silent. But that composure unsettled many in the room, because it raised the question of whether Camilla was accepting the accusation, or whether she believed she did not need to explain herself to anyone. The atmosphere grew heavier as Anne continued. She did not repeat the accusation. She did not raise her voice. She spoke only of boundaries. The moral boundaries the monarchy had long acknowledged without saying aloud. Boundaries that were crossed when Diana's memory was brought into opaque negotiations. Anne did not call for punishment. She did not demand immediate action. What she asked for was acknowledgement, that there are things that cannot be used to protect personal image, regardless of one's position. Camilla's silence stretched on. Not a single justification, not a single explanation. For those witnessing it, the moment was both frightening and revealing in ways no words could be. Because within the monarchy, the one who says nothing is often the one who believes they still have the power not to speak. The confrontation had clearly moved beyond the scope of an ordinary closed meeting. It was no longer an internal exchange. It became a test. Who would stand with principle? Who would choose silence? And who would be forced to intervene to prevent a public fracture? When the tension became impossible to sustain any longer, someone had to speak. When the atmosphere in the room reached a point where it could not continue, King Charles was forced to speak. Not because he wanted to, but because continued silence risked allowing the confrontation between Anne and Camilla to spiral beyond control and leave irreversible consequences within the royal family. Yet the way Charles intervened left many in the room feeling more confused than reassured. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a clear decision. Charles' voice was described as tired, low, and carrying a distinct sense of avoidance. He did not directly refute what Anne had just said, but he also did not defend Camilla against the charge of betrayal, a charge carrying moral condemnation. Charles chose neutral language. He spoke of the complexity of the situation, of the need for stability during a sensitive period, of how the royal family could not allow internal disagreements to turn into a public crisis. But he did not speak of Diana. He did not mention the former advisors. He did not address the moral boundaries Anne had just emphasized. Within the monarchy, how a person avoids an issue often matters more than what they say. And Charles' avoidance that day could not go unnoticed. For Anne, this intervention was not an answer. It was a delay. For others in the room, it was a sign of a king caught between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. Charles did not reject Camilla, but he was also not willing to publicly defend her before the family. That raised an uncomfortable question. If Camilla truly crossed a line, why did Charles not oppose Anne? But if Camilla had done nothing wrong, why did Charles not defend his wife? In the royal system, silence is never neutral. It always serves a purpose, either to protect or to conceal, or to postpone a truth not yet ready to be faced. Some believe Charles was trying to maintain balance, that he understood Anne's anger, but could not sacrifice Camilla at a moment when his own authority was weakening. One wrong move now could cause the fragile structure to collapse faster than expected. But other doubts began to surface, doubts that could not be spoken aloud in that room. Was Charles protecting Camilla out of marital loyalty? Or because he understood that if the story of Diana were reopened once again, his own role in that tragedy would be placed under harsh scrutiny? Charles was the only person in the room who had fully lived through both eras, the period when Diana was alive and the period when Camilla entered the royal family in an official role. He carried a past no one else did, and that past had never been fully resolved. His silence in the face of accusations tied to Diana was therefore not merely an attempt to avoid present conflict. It may have been self-defense, a way to avoid reopening questions he no longer had the strength to confront. Questions of responsibility, of choice, and of consequences that had stretched across decades. In Anne's eyes, that ambiguous intervention was a disappointment, not because she expected Charles to punish Camilla immediately, but because she expected him at least to acknowledge that there are boundaries that cannot be crossed. Charles's silence made Anne understand that if she waited for clarity from the king, she might wait a very long time. In the eyes of others, that moment marked a quiet turning point. The king was still there, but his moral authority had weakened. When a monarch cannot or will not rule on a core issue of principle, a vacuum appears immediately, and that vacuum does not remain empty for long. It requires a new anchor, a figure who can represent the clarity Charles no longer provides. That silence allowed another figure to become the new moral anchor. William was not present in the room where the confrontation between Princess Anne and Camilla took place. But that did not mean he was absent from the story. On the contrary, in the royal family at this moment, William exists as an invisible gravitational force. He does not speak. He does not intervene directly. Yet every decision is shaped to some degree by the reaction that might come from him. Those who understand how royal power truly works know this. Influence does not always need physical presence. Sometimes absence itself is the strongest message. William did not enter that closed meeting. But no one in the room could forget that the future of the monarchy now carries his face. In recent years, William's distance from Camilla has no longer been a matter of press speculation. It is visible in small gestures. Ceremonies where they stand at a deliberate distance, eyes that never meet, conversations reduced to the bare minimum. And most importantly, William's complete abstinence from the carefully constructed efforts to project a harmonious family image that Camilla once worked so hard to promote. There were no public criticisms, no shocking statements. William chose silence. But it was a deliberate silence, cold, steadfast, and difficult to shake. Within the royal family, the silence of an heir is never accidental. It is a signal that a boundary has been drawn, and no one is permitted to cross it. Many internal sources suggest that William never truly accepted Camilla as a legitimate part of his family narrative, not because of personal childhood wounds, but because of the way she has repeatedly sought to reshape the collective memory surrounding Princess Diana. To William, Diana was not only a mother, she was a moral symbol, an emotional foundation, and the very reason the monarchy was forced to change in order to survive. And for that reason, when Camilla was accused of interfering with Diana's spiritual legacy, it did not merely touch the past. It threatened the future William is preparing to inherit. In that context, Princess Anne's role began to be viewed through a different lens, not merely as an angry sister defending principle, but as a figure quietly safeguarding the post-Charles line of succession. Anne understands that a monarchy after Charles cannot be built on moral ambiguity. It cannot ask the public to place trust in the future if the past is being distorted to serve personal interests. Anne did not say this in the meeting room, but those who understand her knew that every question directed at Camilla that day carried the shadow of William, not as someone giving orders, but as a symbol that needed protection. William, by staying out of the conflict, preserved a unique position. He was not drawn into controversy. His name did not appear in any internal record. Yet he became the point of reference for everyone. Those who supported Camilla were forced to ask themselves whether today's actions would push William even further away. Those who opposed her looked to William as a guarantee of future change. That is power without a throne. William does not need to speak to exert pressure. The mere fact that he is the future heir is enough to make every decision more cautious. At a time when King Charles' health is weakening, and official authority is becoming increasingly symbolic, William has become the center of real power, not through decrees, but through expectation. The expectation of the public, the expectation of advisors, and even the expectation of family members searching for a new order that is more stable, more transparent, and less compromised. William represents that, a generation unwilling to rewrite history in order to soften the present. A generation that understands the monarchy's survival in the 21st century no longer rests on bloodline authority, but on moral credibility. And for that reason, when the pieces of the story are assembled, from Charles' decline, to Camilla's controversial moves, to Anne's resistance, and to William's heavy silence, a troubling picture emerges. It is the picture of a monarchy at a crossroads, where power no longer rests solely with the king, where the heir has begun shaping the future even without wearing the crown, and where secret compromises may become the greatest threat to a transition that is meant to be smooth. William does not speak, but the entire royal family is listening. When all the pieces are placed side by side, the image that emerges is no longer a series of isolated conflicts. It is a prolonged and silent crisis, born from unspoken compromises, and expanded through the silence of those who hold power. Camilla today is no longer condemned for the past, not for the controversial love story with Charles, not for the overwhelming shadow of Diana. What places her at the center of public anger is what is happening now. Quiet but calculated steps, opaque contacts, and efforts to control how history will be remembered. The issue is not that Camilla seeks acceptance. It is that she appears to seek absolution by rewriting collective memory. In an institution that survives on symbols and trust, interfering with Diana's spiritual legacy is not merely a strategic mistake. It is an act that crosses a moral boundary the monarchy has always claimed to defend. At that point, Princess Anne emerges as a rare counterweight, not through formal authority, but through an old and resilient form of power. Uncompromising conscience. Anne does not represent rebellion, she represents institutional memory, principles upheld across generations, and the belief that there are limits that cannot be crossed no matter how fragile the circumstances. Anne does not need public support, nor does she seek sympathy. Her actions come from a deeper fear that if the monarchy allows truth to be adjusted for personal benefit, then every remaining symbol becomes hollow. And on the other side stands William, the silent axis around which the entire story turns. Not present at the confrontation, not speaking during moments of tension, yet the one toward whom everyone looks. William represents a future that is not yet official, but already accepted, not because he is the heir, but because he embodies the moral expectation the monarchy desperately needs to preserve. William does not promise perfection, but he promises a clear boundary, a future where power cannot exist without moral responsibility. And it is his selective silence that has made every action in the present heavier, because any compromise made today may become the burden of tomorrow that he will inherit. From Camilla, to Anne, to Charles, to William. The core conflict is not about individuals. It is about an unanswered question. Who does the British monarchy exist to protect? Tradition, or the hidden agreements that allow power to continue operating? The British monarchy does not collapse because of scandal. History has proven that. Scandals come and go. Public anger rises and fades. What can truly shake the foundations of monarchy are the deals made in the shadows. When truth is negotiated, when morality is postponed, and when silence is used as a survival strategy. In that context, King Charles's silence is no longer a sign of fatigue or avoidance. It becomes a dangerous void. Because when the person at the top does not set clear moral limits, every other boundary begins to blur. And that is the greatest warning hidden within this entire story. When power is no longer restrained by morality, the silence of the one at the top becomes the most dangerous confession of all.